Thank you. I'm sorry. Well, good evening. It's an honor for me to be here tonight. I'd like to give a whole talk that would be background for this talk. We don't have time for all that, so I'll pretty soon give you a little bit of background where I'm coming from, but just to set up this talk a little bit, your intrinsic value is tied directly into your origins, where you came from. We kind of have two choices. Either everything happened all by itself or it didn't. Those are really the two options. Either it happened all by itself or it didn't. And there's nothing directly, instantly religious about that. That's just logic. You know, everything happened, the universe came into existence by itself and it went from there, or it didn't. Now, they both have religious implications when you start looking at different details of that and, you know, and go deeper and deeper with that. But your intrinsic value, if everything's just an accident, just laws of physics or whatever, and hey, everything's here, then we really have no ultimate meaning or purpose or value. You could tell yourself that you're important because you want to do this or that, and that's fine, but ultimately there's no objective, you know, significance to your life. You're just another accident like everyone else. If, however, there was something else involved and we're here for a reason, there was a purpose, there was a plan, then you do have intrinsic value, and the more you find out about how you got here, the more you'll find out about your value, how you got here, why you're here, and where you're going when you die. That'd be a whole nother talk. I don't have time to get into that, but how many of you last night saw the debate with Bill Nye and Ken Ham? A number of you saw it. I saw it myself. I wish I had a whole time to comment on that. I thought it was interesting. I thought there were some positive things, and there were some things that concerned me that maybe I would have done different, but everyone sees it, you know, differently, and it's easy to play armchair quarterback and say, oh, you should have done this, should have done that. So a lot of comments I'll have to pass on for now. When we do Q&A at the end, we can cover some of that. But this particular talk here, evolution, probable or problematic, what I'm here tonight to do with this talk is not to prove anything. Science doesn't prove anything. Science can't prove anything. What we do is we come up with models and ideas about things, and then we gather evidence, and if you have enough evidence, you say this thing is virtually proven, it's virtually certain. You never know for sure because you might discover something new tomorrow or next year or whatever, but you can either be very confident that it's accurate or very confident that it's not accurate or somewhere in the middle. So all I'm here tonight to do is to give you just a few reasons why I personally happen to believe what the Bible says about the origins, how we got here, why we're here, what happens to us when we die. And we're going to be looking at science. You know, I could go on for hours and hours what the Bible has to say, and I'd like to do that tonight. It's going to be a little bit more narrow focus, and we're going to look at specifically about evolution. Is it possible or not? And we're going to look at it scientifically, and then again we'll do Q&A, so be thinking about questions that you might have. Again, I'm not here to prove anything or to twist anyone's arm or try to change your mind. I just hope that when you leave here, you'll know more reasons why those people who call themselves Christians and actually believe what the Bible says, kind of know why, where they're coming from. You know, again, it might not change your mind, and that's fine, and we can discuss that, you know, ad nauseum, you know, on and on. We may never, you know, come to the same agreement because there's a lot more to it than just science. There's a spiritual element as well, and again, it would take a long time to develop all that. We're just scratching the surface tonight. So with that, I'll give you a little bit about my personal background. As many of you probably don't know who I am. I grew up here in the area. I'm actually from Milwaukee. Everyone's got to be from somewhere. Not that exciting, but glitches. I don't even know where the laptop is. It's in the back. This is my laptop. My desktop died this morning, and now my laptop seems to have some issues. Here we go. Thanks. So I was actually raised in a Christian home. You can see that this is actually obviously a Christian home. And all that means is that when I was very young, I placed my trust in Jesus Christ as my Savior and grew up in that Christian home, Christian environment. Believed the Bible from cover to cover, primarily because my parents told me it was true. My church told me it was true. I didn't think about it a whole lot myself, a little bit. I had no problem with it, so that's what I believed. But as I got older, I looked into it more and still thought it was true. And after I was growing up there, I went to a high school, graduated from Waukesha North. So again, just local person here. A couple of years ago I graduated. It's been a while, too long. But after graduating from high school, I actually went to a Christian college, John Brown University in Arkansas, to study mechanical engineering. Partway through, I became more interested in physics, but John Brown didn't have a physics major, just a minor, so I knew I had to leave there if I was going to stick with physics, and I ended up going then to the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater to get a degree in physics. And that's when my world changed quite a bit, going from a small Christian college where my engineering professors actually opened up in prayer in every class to a pretty large state university where my physics professors did not open up in prayer. And they were all evolutionists, some of them were atheists, and they were telling me in essence that everything I believed was wrong. And that really shook me. It made me uncomfortable to be surrounded by these very intelligent PhD scientists who I assumed had a lot of evidence for what they believed. But I realized for the first time in my life that even though I knew what I believed, I didn't know why. I had never really looked into it. I believed it, but how did I know God existed? How do I know the Bible's the inspired word of God? How do I know that God actually created things the way that Genesis describes? How do I know there was a flood? How do I know Jesus is the Son of God? I didn't know why, I just believed him. So God put it on my heart to start looking into these things and finding evidence, and I've found tons of evidence for all those areas. So I've been speaking and researching now for 28 years. It's been a long time, and I've been in full-time ministry the past 7 years with the Creation Education Center ministry that I started 7 years ago. So I travel around the country and now out of the country as well, doing this full-time. So that's my background in a nutshell. I don't want to talk any more about me, but one of the most interesting things I learned about physics was never trust an atom. They make up everything. Now, the reason I put this up here is to get you guys to beg me to stick with science and leave the humor up to the professionals, but you will see my bad sense of humor from time to time in these talks. It's just kind of my warped mind and how it works. But getting back to this talk, evolution probable or problematic? Now, how many of you have ever seen Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? Quite a few of you. It's kind of a dangerous show to watch because you might find out that maybe you're not smarter than a fifth grader. But we're going to change it up here a little bit tonight and ask, are you smarter than a PhD scientist? Now, most people would say, well, of course not. I mean, those PhD guys, they're just really smart. I honestly, sincerely believe that after you hear this talk tonight, you will be more intelligent than most PhD scientists across the world when it comes to this creation-evolution controversy. And here's why. Because the vast majority of scientists out there aren't even studying evolution. They're making rocket fuel, they're making cures for diseases, they're making faster computers, they're doing great stuff, and they're smart people. They're not studying evolution. They heard about it maybe in high school, a little bit in college, but then they specialize in something else. They really don't know much about it. They just trust that there are other scientists out there who do study it, and apparently they've proven it, so it's good enough for them. That's really the way it operates. That's even my personal experience from talking to many of them. Even the scientists who study this, many of them don't know what you're going to hear tonight. It would be new to them because they, again, have areas of speciality and they're really smart in a small sliver of area where they get their PhD and all that, so they're not expected to know everything. But some of this is cutting edge stuff. And I think whether you're here tonight as a Christian, or a skeptic, an atheist, a Buddhist, whoever you might be, independent of the whole creation evolution controversy, I think this is just cool stuff. I think it'll make your head spin when we start looking at DNA and stuff like that. And so we're going to get into this talk here. Quick review. I'm not going to cover all of this because it would go too long, but there's a few things I usually like to cover before I get into this. We're just going to cover one. Defining evolution, talking about science in the Bible and God and evolution. We're just going to cover the first one very quickly because, again, we need to define our terms. When I'm talking about evolution, I'm not simply talking about change. Evolution certainly would involve change, but it's not just any kind of change. We see change all the time, but change doesn't equal evolution, because sometimes people say, well, I don't believe in evolution. Oh, you're kidding. You don't believe in change? You're crazy. We see change all the time. That's a fact. That's proof of evolution. If you reject evolution, you're rejecting change. And so you're insane. I'm not just talking about change, because we see change all the time, but it's got to be a very specific type of change in order for evolution to work. I'm also not talking about different types of dogs and horses and cats. We see this all the time. We see different breeds of dogs and things like that. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. These are facts of science. Also, the beaks on the finches that Darwin got very excited about. These are facts of science. We see it all the time. No one argues that we see these things. These are examples of change, but they're not the types of change that would be required by evolution as they're teaching it in the public school system and state universities. This is what I'm referring to by evolution. It's supposedly about 3.8 billion years ago, there was a single-celled organism that slowly evolved into every other life form on this planet by accident over millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of years. This, I personally believe, is a story that's told about the past. When no one is around to see it happening, we can't reproduce it in a laboratory, and we can't test it directly. It's a story that's told about the past. Many people believe it happened this way. 3.8 billion years ago, chemicals got together to form a cell, and that turned into every other life form over millions and millions of years. We also call this molecules to man evolution. So when I talk about evolution, I'm talking about non-living chemicals and molecules getting together to form a living cell which could reproduce itself and then change itself over time into every other life form on this planet. That's what I mean by evolution. So now getting to the premise of this particular talk, certain things when you look at them from a certain angle or a certain distance, they look pretty good. Like this bright red BMW. You envision opening the hood and seeing a nice beautiful engine inside there. Well, what if when you pop the hood you saw this? It's actually empty there, wires are hanging there. It doesn't look so good anymore. Maybe now you know why it had a $2,000 price tag on it. You know, it's missing an engine. It doesn't look so good anymore, and you peeked under the hood. Well, I think it's very similar with evolution. Certain portions of the evolutionary story sound very plausible, but when you peek under the hood to see what would have to happen inside to make this possible, that's when you start to see huge, insurmountable problems. For example, we have an Australian lungfish and a newt. These two creatures don't look completely different. They look kind of similar. It does not take much imagination at all to envision the fins on the lungfish getting stronger, a little bit longer, to kind of start to crawl on the bottom and then peek its head out of the water and then kind of learn how to breathe there. Maybe it was run out of food in the ocean, so it starts to forage up onto land and learn how to breathe there and find some food there, and it turns into a newt. Little small changes over millions of years. Those are the types of stories that we hear about what goes on. And again, it doesn't take much imagination. It seems plausible. But again, when you peek under the hood, what would have to go on inside in the genetics to make all those changes? That's when it gets very challenging. Richard Dawkins, probably most of you are familiar with him, one of the world's leading atheists, very outspoken evolutionist, intelligent scientist. This is one of the quotes that he had. He said, "You cannot be both sane and well-educated and disbelieve in evolution. The evidence is so strong that any sane, educated person has got to believe in evolution." So if you're here tonight and you say, I don't really believe in evolution so much, you are insane, you're crazy. Because the evidence is so strong, no reasonable person denies it. That's very intimidating to hear that from a scientist or a professor or a teacher. So a lot of people are actually intimidated to say, well, no, I don't reject evolution. I mean, there's evidence and stuff. So it can be very intimidating when intelligent people make dogmatic statements. Proverbs 18:17 says this, "The first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him." And you've all been in these situations before where somebody makes a statement, and at first you're like, boy, that makes a lot of sense. You can't argue with that. And then someone else says, well, wait a minute. What about this? What about that? What about that? It's like, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, okay, that doesn't make sense anymore. And that's what happens, I think, very often. And I facetiously say that Evolution 1:1 says the only one to plead his cause seems right because no one else is allowed to come along and challenge him or present other views. That's what we have generally in the public school system and state universities. They're only teaching one side, evolution, everything's natural, only natural explanations for everything. So is it any wonder that most people grow up kind of believing in something about evolution because that's all they hear? And then if they want to become a scientist, they go to the state universities, they get training to become a scientist, they learn more about evolution there, they go out and they get jobs, it's in the textbooks, that's what they teach, and so most scientists are evolutionists. Most of them have only been presented one side, and it can seem very plausible when you present part of the story. Again, that's what we're going to see the rest of this talk. In some of my other talks, we talk about the big picture. We don't have time tonight to go into everything, but whoever you are tonight, again, whether you're an atheist, a Muslim, a Mormon, a Christian, whomever you are, you all have a worldview. The way that you look at things around you, the thing that you use, the assumptions you use to interpret everything else that you look at. And your worldview has to answer a number of basic questions. Number one, the origin of stuff. How did we get matter and energy out of nothing? Where did it come from? What does your worldview say about where everything came from to begin with, matter and energy? Secondly, once you have stuff, how did all this stuff form stars, galaxies, and planets? The laws of physics that we know today are very troublesome for gases just forming these planets and stars. We don't have time to go into all those details. Then, once you get planets, how do you get life on a planet? How do you get those non-living chemicals to come together to form a living cell? This is one of the biggest problems for people who believe in evolution. In fact, a lot of evolutionists said, that's not my problem. I just talk about how this creature changes into another one. It's not part of evolution, how it got started. It is, it's part of the big picture. You got to get that first cell to begin with, and it has to happen according to them naturally. You can't have God doing that and then backing off and saying, okay, I'm done here, you guys take it from here. You could, if that was your belief, but then you'd probably want to provide some evidence for that. And if you're not going to bring him in any other stages of the point, why would you bring him in there? And you're certainly not teaching that in the school systems. Okay, well, yep, God was necessary for this, but now let's get him out of the school so we can teach the rest of it, and we might bring him back in again if we need him. But that's another problem I talk about in a different talk. The last one is, once you have living things, how do you get that single cell living thing to change into every other life form on this planet, including human beings? And that's what we're going to focus on in this particular talk, the origin of species, the variety of life that we have. Specifically, how do you get that single-celled organism to turn into a human being over, they say, almost 4 billion years? Now, there's a lot of arranging and storytelling that goes on with evolution. For instance, we've got 4 examples of transportation here. I could arrange these from simpler to more complex and talk about the evolution of the motorcycle. How we had a tricycle many, many years ago, and the small wheels in the back of the tricycle came together to form the larger back wheel of the bike. And then the gears and chains of the bike moved forward to make an electric motor of the scooter. And then the electric motor of the scooter slowly moved forward and turned into a gas combustion engine, and that's how we got motorcycles. Now, that's pretty silly to say that, because we know that that didn't happen, but it's very similar to much of what happens in teaching evolution. For example, we have the evolution of the horse, from Eohippus all the way up to the modern horse. Get some fossils out, kind of put them in line, which, oh, this one looks simpler, this one's more complex, we'll line them up, and then you tell a story how one changed into another one. Here's an interesting quote from Dr. Niles Eldredge. He's a former curator at the American Museum of Natural History, very ardent evolutionist. This is what he said. He said, I admit that an awful lot has gotten into the textbooks as though it were true. For instance, the most famous example still on exhibit in the American Museum, that's his museum, is the exhibit on horse evolution. That has been presented as literal truth in textbook after textbook. Now I think that that is lamentable, but by the time it filters down to the textbooks, we got a problem. He knows it didn't happen that way, it's not really true, and apparently it's okay to have it in the museums, but if you put it in the textbooks and you're teaching that, that probably shouldn't happen. I think it definitely shouldn't happen, and why should it even be in the museums if they know it didn't happen that way? But it just creeps in there, and they're not very quick to take it out when they have evidence against it. Then we have the idea of fish evolving into amphibians. Well, what did it look like in between, all those millions of years in between? That's what we call a missing link. Well, you know what? They've discovered the missing link. It's Tiktaalik, that was mentioned in the debate last night by Bill Nye, which I was kind of shocked because Tiktaalik's already been kind of taken off the table. In the same layer where they found Tiktaalik, they found quadruped footprints. So quadrupeds had already, quote, evolved when Tiktaalik was around. Tiktaalik isn't on its way to evolving into one of those creatures. They already existed. So that's disqualified, but Bill Nye apparently didn't know about that. But that's what they do. They just find fossils, kind of line them up, and then tell the story of how one changed into another one. But that's not much different than doing this, talking about how an Etch-a-Sketch evolved into an iPad. But again, you know, we laugh because it sounds silly because we know there's no way that the simple internal workings of an Etch-a-Sketch are going to slowly on their own kind of just change into something as complex as an iPad. It's not going to happen. But again, we can tell stories about that. What would look in the middle like? Well, maybe it's something like that. You imagine the links in the middle. Something like a little bit of one, a little bit of the other one. But you know the transition, how would it function as it's trying to change from the sand in there to potato chips and all those things? Just how's that going to function? What's going to drive it forward like that? So, how do we get that single cell to turn all the way into a human being? Well, when we have children, our kids don't come out looking exactly like us. There are changes that occur. They may have similar hair color, eye colors, things like that. There are similarities, but they don't look exactly like us because changes do occur. We see those all the time. Well, what are those changes? Well, there's basically 2 kinds of changes. There's built-in variation, which has to do with our genes. And that's fairly predictable because we're learning a lot about DNA and our genes, and they code for skin color and eye shape and colors and all these things. So we kind of know what the genes can do. So it's kind of predictable. But the other kind here is random mutations. That's accidental copying errors. When the DNA duplicates itself, there's a lot of information on it that we'll learn about. And mistakes are made. It's, oops, got that wrong. Oops, got that wrong. Oops, got that wrong. That's unpredictable. You don't know what mistakes are going to be made. So those are the 2 types of changes. Genes, built-in information that can do a variety of things, and then mistakes. So we're going to look at both of these. We're going to start looking at the built-in variation. We have an example of two dogs here that have medium-length fur. We actually have two copies of each gene, and typically one will get expressed or the other. Sometimes they can combine, but you might have, in a sense, this is oversimplified, but let's just say a gene for blue eyes and a gene for brown eyes. Well, you might have brown eyes because the brown one got expressed, but then you pass on the blue one to your children, and your children have blue eyes. Hey, where'd that come from? Well, it came from you. It's just that gene wasn't expressed in you. So each of these dogs have two copies of genes for making fur length. Let's say they have one for making long fur, one for making short fur. In their case, they combined and they ended up with medium length fur. When they breed, they each get to pass on one gene. They don't get to choose, I'll do this one. One goes or the other. Let's say they both happen to pass on a gene for short fur. Now the puppy has two copies, but they both make short fur. It doesn't matter which one's expressed, the puppy's going to have short fur. The other end of the spectrum, they both pass on a gene for long fur. Well, the puppy's going to come out long fur, doesn't have a choice. The middle one passes on a gene for long fur, the other one a short fur gene. The puppy will typically come out with medium length fur, or it could be long or short because it's got that option there. So these genes allow for a variety of features on dogs, but it doesn't just do fur length, it does other things like making big dogs, small dogs, long ears, short ears, just all the different features we see in dogs. It's all coded ahead of time on the genes. Well, if you take a look at these two sets of animals and ask yourself which set looks more similar to each other, and it's pretty obvious. Set A, those animals look a lot more like each other than the animals in set B. And that's because the animals in set A are really the same general kind of animal. Now, the Bible actually tells us in the book of Genesis that God created creatures to reproduce after their kind. It uses the word kind. It doesn't say species. That's a more modern word that science has come up with to try to describe groups of animals that typically don't breed with other groups. They say, well, okay, that's a species. But the Bible says that God would create creatures that they could reproduce after their kind. So they could produce a nice variety, but it's always within limits. Variety from here to there, but you're not going to create something totally different. It says it many times in Genesis. In fact, you can breed these things, a dog and a wolf, and you get a wolf dog. It's no surprise. This is real science. In fact, you can breed a dog, dingo, coyote, and wolf. They can all interbreed. They'll call them different species, but they can actually breed together because scientists have a hard time deciding what really is a species. They're just not quite sure. But all these animals can breed together. When you do a dog and a wolf, you get a wolf dog. No surprise. But you can breed a wolf and a dog until you're blue in the face and you're never going to get an ostrich because they don't have information on their genes to make beaks and feathers. It's not there. That's not going to occur because it's not the same kind of animal. There's other animals you can breed together. You can breed a zebra and a donkey and you get a zonkey. It sounds kind of funny, but it's real science. Why? Do these look like completely different animals? No, it's basically the same animal. One just has a better paint job. And so you get a zonkey. There are other animals you can breed. You can breed a lion and a tiger, and you get a liger. Again, sounds kind of funny, but why? They're both large cats. So you can do that. But what you can't do is breed a lion and a kangaroo and get a liangaroo. Not going to happen because they're not the same kind of animal. The Bible would predict you can't do that, and we see with real science today, no, it's not going to happen. There are a bunch of other animals you're also not going to get, and it's these here. This is what happens when you have Photoshop and too much time on your hands, of which I have neither. I didn't do these, just got them off the internet. They're entertaining, they're kind of fun because we know that can't happen. The genes don't work that way. So that was the built-in variation. Let's take a look at these random mutations, Nick, these accidental copying errors. This is now how evolution works. So we can pretend we're in a classroom talking about evolution. I'm going to teach you how evolution works, just one portion of it here. We have an organism up there. It's going to copy itself. It's going to reproduce. It's going to copy its DNA and pass it on. So it has children. It passes on its DNA, and the children come out looking pretty much like it does because it's the same DNA. Then the children have children, which are the grandchildren, and they come out, passing on the DNA, look very similar to the parents and the grandparents. And then the grandchildren have children, and oops, we got a problem here. Something happened. Mutations, accidental copying errors are going on here. So it changed the offspring there. And then what we're told is that natural selection comes along and wipes out the bad changes and keeps the good ones. And then reproduction continues. So now the new ones reproduce. So you got more new ones, and then you got the original ones keeping on reproducing. Imagine this going on for millions and millions and millions of years. Can you imagine the great variety of life we'd have on this planet? I guarantee you, the non-Christian students in the public school systems and state universities see this and like, makes perfect sense to me. Can't deny evolution. And it's facts. That's how it works. But I guarantee you, the Christian students sitting in that same class say, it sounds pretty good to me. I mean, how can you argue with that? I mean, it makes perfect sense. Until you do as Paul Harvey, you guys are too young to probably remember Paul Harvey, great radio announcer, and he was famous for always telling us the rest of the story. We're going to kind of do that here. We're going to take a closer look at these mutations. Can mutations really take a single-celled organism and change it into a human being? And this is where I think it gets really interesting. I'm going to make three major points about mutations. First of all, that they are purposeless, undirected, and random. Secondly, they occur in the DNA. And thirdly, they are almost entirely detrimental or bad. We're going to go through each one of these really quick. Starting out that they're purposeless and undirected. They're not trying to do anything. It's not like you had a creature, a billion years ago that didn't have ears, and it's thinking to itself, you know what, I've heard really good things about ears, so I'm going to see if when I reproduce myself, I can make some mistakes in my DNA, and then hopefully my children will, and their grandchildren, and eventually my great, whatever grandchildren will have ears. It's going to be great. They're going to love them. No, it's not trying to do anything. But that's not what we hear from the literature very often. This is from Nova Online, an evolutionary source. It said it's sometimes convenient when trying to make sense of evolution to think of changes within a species of having a purpose, as though Mother Nature has some intended goal that she sets out to achieve. The bacteria want to survive, someone might reason when thinking about the declining effects of antibiotics, and so they evolve into resistant strains. Of course, there is no purpose in evolution, just random mutations within DNA, most of which are detrimental to the survivability of the organism. Those are the three major points that I just made, all in this quote from an evolutionary scientist. There's no purpose. They're not trying to do anything. It's just random changes. But here's an interesting quote from Discover News talking about dinosaurs. It said, presumably the sauropods evolved large body size as a strategy to deter predators. What do we have going on here? It's kind of like this, kind of humorously, but this is the general intention. Apparently, at some point in the past, dinosaurs were not as big as they eventually came to be. And they were having problems. And they were sitting around the campfire one night and they're saying, hey guys, we got to do something. Our predators are coming after us. If we don't do something, we're going to go extinct. Do you guys have any ideas? And he said, no, our brains are too small. And then one of them says, I got an idea. What if when they come after us, we hop on our motorcycles and ride off into the sunset? And the other dinosaur says, you can't do that. They haven't been invented yet. Okay, good point. And the second dinosaur says, well, we can get machine guns out and shoot them. It's like, those haven't been invented either. And the third dinosaur says, I got an idea. What if we evolve really large body size and we can scare them away? Now that's a good idea. You guys all in agreement? Yeah, okay, break. And then they all go out and they get big. That's the impression. There was a strategy. This is their verbiage in this science magazine. They had a strategy. We need to do something. Okay, let's get big. That's not how it works. I don't know an evolutionist on the planet who believes in this. The more intelligent they are, the more they realize, no, there's no purpose here, it's just accidents. But the common magazines will word it this way, and often in classrooms it'll be taught this way, like this creature needed the ability to breathe air and crawl up into land because it was running out of food in the ocean, so it learned how to do that and evolved lungs. Okay, fine with me. Like, no, it didn't try, and you can't try to change its DNA. But again, that's the impression that we get from the news magazines and things like that. Secondly, these mutations are occurring in the DNA. So look very quickly at DNA. DNA is like a very, 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 very complex blueprint with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of information on it. In fact, just to give you an idea of how much information is on your DNA, let's say you had just a teaspoon amount of your own DNA, and you want to back that up in case it crashes or something, you lose it. We back up our hard drives. Mine crashed literally this morning. I had it backed up the day before, fortunately. But we back things up all the time. So let's say we want to back up just a teaspoon amount of your DNA onto CDs. Now CDs can hold a lot of information. In fact, you can hold about 150,000 pages of text on a single CD. That's a lot of information on one CD. So how many CDs would we need to back up just a teaspoon amount of your DNA? You would need 100 CDs, but don't write that down because I just lied to you. You would need 1,000 CDs, don't write that down either. You would need 1 million CDs, don't write that down either. That was the last time I'm going to lie. You would actually need 1 million CDs given to you every minute for 9.5 years. then you'd have enough CDs to back up just a teaspoon amount of your DNA. That's 5 trillion. It gives you an appreciation for the national debt. 5 trillion CDs. Here's the analogy. Someone walks up to you and says, hey, I heard you're going to back up that teaspoon of DNA there. I got what you're going to need here. They walk up to you with a stack in their hands of 1 million CDs. And you're like, oh my word. You say, I'll be back. And they come back a minute later with another stack. Now you're holding 2 million, one in each hand. You're like, oh, and they say, I'll be back. Come back a minute later, give you another stack. They do that for 9.5 years. Can you imagine how annoying that would be? But you would need that just to back up a teaspoon. But you know what? They teach in every public school system and all the state universities. It's just an accident. All that information got here by accident. There isn't a single process on this earth where matter and energy can create information. It stores information. It does a great job of storing it, but it does not create the information. Every experience we've ever had as human beings is that information only comes from intelligence. Everything we see, books, magazines, computer hard drive, software, all that, it came from an intelligent source. So when we see even more information on our DNA, why do we say, oh, that just happened by accident? We don't know any processes that could do that, but people who want to believe it all happened by accident are forced to conclude that. And the DNA, you're all familiar with DNA, a little coiled up ladder. This is how it breaks down. It's kind of like a set of encyclopedias, and the letter, a single letter in the set of encyclopedias would be represented about on one of the rungs. It's called a nucleotide. So every rung is like a single letter out of that set of encyclopedias. Then groupings of these rungs, those would be words. Put a bunch of rungs together, you get a word out of the set of encyclopedias. The chapters we call genes. You've all heard of genes. There are thousands or tens of thousands of these nucleotides or rungs put together. Then we have chromosomes. Chromosomes would be like a single volume of the set of encyclopedias. And finally, the entire set of encyclopedias, that's what we call the genome. For people, we call it the human genome. Heard all those terms before. That's kind of how it breaks down. It's a little biology 101. Last section here, that these mutations are almost entirely detrimental or bad. And this, it's going to really start to pick up. We're going to start to get into some cutting edge stuff. All that before was background to getting into this stuff that I think is really cool. And here's how I think the story of evolution goes. This analogy I'm going to give you comes from a book called Genetic Entropy by Dr. John Sanford from Cornell University. He and I are on the board of another group called Logos Research Associates. Brilliant guy. He invented something called the gene gun. He's known worldwide for that. Brilliant scientist, and he's a creationist. He believes in six-day creation, and great guy, very humble guy. But this comes from his book, Genetic Entropy. He says, let's say you had that single-celled organism. Well, the amount of information in a single-cell bacteria is about equivalent of a biochemistry textbook. Now, there's a lot of information in a biochemistry textbook. And that's about how much information is in a single-cell bacteria. But remember, we need to change that single-cell bacteria all the way into a human being. So we can't just keep copying that cell over and over. We got to make changes or we're never going to get a human being. Well, here's a sample page from the textbook, and we've got some text off to the right here. And again, if we just keep copying this over and over and over perfectly, 50 billion years from now, we'll just have a lot of these textbooks. No changes at all. So we got to make changes if we want it to somehow improve. Well, what are these changes? Well, the changes are the mutations we've been talking about. And here's what mutations are. Here are 3 examples. We have a duplication. The word the up there, I added an extra T before it. Now, if you were reading this textbook, you'd say, oh, I know, it's supposed to be a the, that's a typo, and you'd say the, and you'd move on. That's not how our genes work. The genes don't say, oh, I know what it meant. No, it's a mistake there. It doesn't mean anything. Secondly, we have a deletion. The word energy, take the letter E out. It doesn't spell energy anymore. It's meaningless. Then you have a substitution. Take the word electron, take the N out and put a Y in there instead. A random change. Doesn't spell electron anymore. It's meaningless. Electroi doesn't mean anything. These are examples of mutations. And this is what supposedly drives evolution. So we're going to look at this further and further. And I'm just presenting information. I'm not trying to twist anyone's arm. Just think about something you may have not been exposed to before. I'm really excited about this. Just continues to confirm the faith that I have in the Bible and God and creation and all that. And if nothing else, you learn some cool things here tonight. The challenge for evolution, though, gets worse than just what we've looked at so far. And again, this is where it gets cutting edge. Let's say you were looking at a segment of your DNA. Just a little segment there, and you were reading it. And let's say it said, was it a rat I saw? Weird sentence here, but you'll see why in a second. Let's clean it up, take the punctuation away. Was it a rat I saw? Now in English, we read from left to right. But you may have noticed with this, you can actually read it right to left. Was it a rat I saw? It's kind of fun. It's called a palindrome. You can read it forwards and backwards. This is what we've discovered in our DNA. Much of our DNA can be read not only forwards, but also backwards. But the challenge for evolution gets much worse than that, because that was the same phrase, forwards and backwards. Take a look at this, the word desserts. Flip that around, it spells stressed, which is what I get when I don't get dessert. So forwards and backwards. Let's now introduce a random mutation. We'll just randomly delete the T there. We not only messed up the top message going left to right, we also messed up the secondary message going backwards. It doesn't spell stressed anymore. One random mutation not only messed up one message, it messed up the underlying message going backwards. But you know what? Our DNA doesn't have just these little words that flip back and forth. We have up to entire chapters of complex information that can be read both forwards and backwards. You read it one way, it makes these complex proteins that do one function in your body. You read it backwards, it makes completely different proteins that do a completely different function in your body. Now here's a real life example. Let's say you guys graduate, it is possible. I did it, so you guys can. And let's say you get a job at a smartphone factory. And it's your job to write the instruction manual to give to the manufacturing plant to make these phones. So your boss comes to you one day and says, I got a project for you. I need you to write the chapter in the manual that explains how this phone is going to download apps from the web. You say, yeah, I can do that. It's my training. No problem. I said, okay, thanks. And he's walking away. He says, oh, sorry, forgot one thing. When you write your chapter explaining how to download apps from the web, you have to write it in such a way that if we read your chapter backwards, it's going to explain how to play MP3 files. You'd be staring at him like, well, you're kidding, right? I mean, that's impossible. And that is impossible. It's humanly impossible. You can't even program a computer to do that. I've done computer programming for 18 years. It can't be done. Yet that's what we're seeing in our DNA. Entire chapters of complex instructions read one way, you read it backwards, entirely different instructions. How is that going to happen by accident? And then when you introduce random changes, even if once in a great while, theoretically, once in a great while you could put it in a letter there, and it might give a slight improvement to that little word in that little sentence or whatever, but you're messing up the message going backwards. And you'll see the challenge for evolution actually gets worse than that. Here we have a strange statement here, I like chocolate later that evening. It's strange because it's actually two phrases. We got I like chocolate, which is true, and then later that evening. It overlaps in the middle in LATE. Two phrases that overlap. Okay, let's introduce a random mutation here. We changed the E into an H. We just messed up both of these messages. It doesn't spell I like chocolate and it doesn't spell later that evening anymore. One random change messed up two messages because it overlaps. But our DNA doesn't just overlap in a couple letters like that. It overlaps up to entire chapters of information again. Overlapping. Can you imagine trying to write something like that? Impossible. But the challenge gets worse than that. Here's that same phrase again. Let's underline a few segments here and then bring the letters down below. And it spells, I like her hat. We're finding this in our DNA. There are spliced messages. You go into this chapter, gene, you take out a few little segments, you take out some segments here, you go somewhere else, take out some segments, put them all together, you got another set of instructions. Let's introduce a random mutation here. We will just delete the H there. Well, you know what? It messes up I like chocolate, but it also no longer spells I like her hat. The spliced message is messed up. So you're messing up messages going forwards, backwards, overlapping, and splicing, because there's all these layers of information. But we don't just see a couple letters that are spliced out. We see up to long sentences and short paragraphs that can be spliced out. Imagine going to that biochemistry textbook, going to different chapters, taking out short paragraphs and long sentences and segments here, a few words there, just doing that, put them together, you got a whole other chapter of information. Absolutely amazing. But the challenge for evolution gets worse than that. We have embedded information. Take a look at this sentence here. Can you show Mike Olson checks from Oliver's labeled fax and set it on Herb's desk? Let's circle every 9th letter and bring them below. What you see then, it spells chocolate. There's a theme going on here. It's my talk, so I can do that. So we have embedded messages here. That's what we see in our DNA. Let's introduce a random mutation. We're going to delete the W up there in the word show. What that does in essence is it shifts all the letters after that over one spot. So now the new message below is that, which means absolutely nothing. So one random change is messing up the embedded information in addition to the spliced and the overlapping and the forwards and backwards. But guess what? It gets worse than that. We have encrypted messages. I actually had 2 interviews with the CIA to work in their cryptographic analysis division. Details for some other time, but let's take a look at this here. This phrase here seems completely meaningless. But what if you found out there was an encryption key? Everywhere you see an H, it's really an A. Everywhere you see a B, it's really a C. For example, everywhere you see a Y, it's really T, so this Y should be a T and that Y should be a T. You do the substitutions and it spells this as an encrypted message. That's what we're seeing in our DNA. It's unbelievable. And to think that all happened by random processes, let's just take a second to talk about data encryption. What's required to create data encrypted messages? These are the steps. Number 1, you have to develop a language system using symbols. Keep in mind that if you're talking about evolution and natural processes, which Bill and I did last night, and many other scientists at universities, everything has natural explanations. You are literally talking about protons and electrons and neutrons smashing into each other, just natural things of physics and all that. Those processes are supposed to create what we're seeing here. By accident, no purpose, they're not trying to do anything, just, hey, look what we did. You have to develop this language system. So, what you have to say by random particles smashing into each other, that if we have 3 sticks like this and we put them together this way, we're going to call that an A. And if we have some shapes like this that come together this way, that's going to be a B. You have to build an entire alphabet by random processes of nature. Then you have to be able to create and define words. When we put these 4 letters together, it's going to represent this object here. You have to create an entire dictionary of words by random processes of nature. Then you have to be able to write meaningful sentences and paragraphs, which requires rules of grammar. How do particles smashing together create rules of grammar? Then you have to establish the encryption system with the key. After that, you have to be able to have a system that codes and decodes the system. And then lastly, you have to be able to create the ability to read and carry out this thing. Otherwise, the whole thing is useless. There isn't a scientist on the face of this planet who can even begin to explain how natural processes created an encryption system like this. But this is what we have in our DNA. Yeah, it gets worse than that. We're coming close to the end here. We have 3D information. This one's a little bit harder to depict. But our DNA, like the coiled up ladder, it makes proteins, and the proteins are kind of the engine of life. They do most of the functions in our body. But protein isn't just like a straight ladder. Protein has to be folded up on itself into a 3-dimensional shape to have its proper function. If it doesn't get folded properly, it gets destroyed and the parts are reused. So it's like a lock and a key. It's got to be just right for it to carry out its function. So we just have 7 words going across the bottom of the screen there, straight across, like maybe a ladder or whatever. Let's fold them, kind of stack them in a sense into a 3D format. So we stack them like this, and what you notice is going up and down is the word success. Well, you make a random change to that, deleting letters, changing them, duplicating them, shifting them over, you don't fold them right, you destroy that information going up and down, but that's what we have in our DNA. When it folds just the right way, it's carrying information that way. And one last time, and I'm actually skipping things, it gets worse than that. We actually have communication from the cell membrane into the nucleus where the DNA is. Communication back and forth. Well, you make random changes to the DNA inside, how is the cell membrane going to know what random changes have occurred? The DNA would have to say, hey, cell membrane, just for your information, we've made these random changes here, and you need to keep that in mind when you communicate with us, otherwise things are going to get messed up. That's what we see, intercellular communication, not just within the cell, but actually from one cell to another, information transporting back and forth and being coordinated together. It is unbelievable. But even with all of that, I have proof that evolution's a fact. Here's why. We are 98% similar in our DNA to chimpanzees. Now, how many of you have ever heard anything like that? 96, 98, 99? Quite a few of you. If you haven't heard it yet, you will hear it. Now, you hear something like this, and you're just like, how can you deny that? 98% similar, I mean, how can you get stronger proof than that? It's one of those things on the surface, it sounds like, yeah, what do you do with that? Well, we're actually nowhere near 98% similar to chimpanzees, but let's look at this a little bit further. Scientists used to say that, and I don't have time to go into all the details where they come up with the 98%. In general, one of the things they did is they looked at the human genome, which they had mapped out pretty good, and they were starting to look at the chimp genome, and any segments that seemed very different from each other, they didn't bother to compare, because they're too different. But the segments that look similar, let's compare those, because they're similar. Wow, they're 98% similar. Well, you threw all the ones out that weren't similar, and there were many other things that went on to get the 98%. They've done a lot more studying. Now they're down to about 70% similarity, which is too low for them. They're thinking we should be 70% similar to a chicken. But now we're only 70% similar to a chimpanzee. And when you think about it, chimpanzees' eyes are very similar to our eyes. So if you're going to have a blueprint that develops these eyes, they're going to be very similar. They're making the same thing. So there ought to be a number of similarities between chimp DNA and human DNA, because we look more like a chimp than we do a fern. So you'd expect that, but now it's just gone way too far. But what's interesting is PBS Special said that this difference, 98% similarity, and amounts to just a couple of spelling errors. What in the world did that mean? This is what they meant. The difference between humans and chimps is just some spelling errors, copying errors in the DNA that have happened over time. Just a couple spelling errors. You take this genome, make a couple spelling errors, and you change something that's more like a chimpanzee into a human being. That's absolutely crazy, especially when you look at the changes that we just talked about, these mutations. And what's interesting is, let's just humor them for a second. Let's say we are 98% similar, which we're not, but let's just say we are. Even if you're not smarter than a fifth grader, you know if we're 98% similar, we're 2% different. Everyone can figure that out. Well, the human genome, just a single strands inside a single nucleus there, is an equivalent of about 3 billion letters. So if you were to write out in book form, there's about 3 billion letters there in the human genome. Well, a 2% difference of 3 billion letters, that amounts to 60 million letters, 60 million changes, or 60 million spelling errors. 60 million letters is an equivalent of 50 200-page books. So let's bring it home here. What they're saying is, you take a genome from some ape-like creature, you introduce 60 million mistakes, and that's going to produce 50 new pages, 200-page books of new information that wasn't there before to create something as wonderfully complex as a human being. That's crazy. Literally, seriously, a kindergartner understands this. If you ask a kindergartner, what's your favorite book? And they say, Danny and the Dinosaur, or whatever. And you ask them, if we just open up your book and randomly stick our fingers in and delete letters and change words and flip them around or whatever, do you think your book's going to get better and better and better? Or what do you think is going to happen? They'll say, well, no, it's going to get worse and worse. In fact, pretty soon it won't take long, I won't be able to read it at all. A kindergartner understands that. You have to be very highly educated to not get that. And I say that sincerely. I'm not making fun of scientists who are very intelligent. They are. I don't argue with that at all. But sometimes they're too smart and they're too proud of their own intelligence, wanting to figure everything out on their own and not wanting to say, you know what, there is a God. Because if there is a God, then maybe he gets to set the rules, and I don't want to live by those rules, so I'm going to figure out everything naturalistically, and I don't have to obey anything like a God or the Bible or anything like that. So, and many scientists are coming from that approach. They just don't see some of these simpler things that everyone else, it's kind of obvious to them. But that's a big challenge. How do you make 60 million random changes and have it get so much better? You got a human being. Well, we actually share 50% of our genes with bananas, but that doesn't make us half bananas. Maybe it does, but so it's not just similarities in genes. There's so much more to it than that we don't have time to go into the rest of those details. But wrapping this up, getting back to our original premise, again, certain things look great from a distance or a certain angle, and again, you envision peeking under the hood and seeing that beautiful engine, but what happened is we peeked under the hood and we saw that the engine of evolution is missing. It's just not going to work that way. These random changes are not going to produce upward evolution, creating new information all along the way for about 4 billion years, taking that single-celled organism into a human being. One quote wrapping this up here from a professor of genetics says, genetics has no proofs for evolution. It has trouble explaining it. The closer one looks at the evidence for evolution, the less one finds of substance. In fact, the theory keeps on postulating evidence and failing to find it, moves on to other postulates, fossil missing links, natural selection of improved forms, positive mutations, etc. This is not science. So, the Bible happens to say, first verse of the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's my starting point. I've believed that since I was a little kid. And all of my experiences growing up and all my science and engineering and research and all that has confirmed that over and over and over. I don't see things that contradict that. Yeah, on the surface you can throw things out there that sound like, oh wow, that would be a challenge. But you look into it further and like realize, okay, now I see where they're coming from, where they've gone off a little bit here. But I'm very confident in what I believe, and I'm just here to explain why it is that I believe in what I believe. All I ask you is to ask yourself, what is it that you believe? And why? And do you really know why you believe, or does it really come down to, well, I mean, all the scientists say, oh, they all believe in evolution, and they prove it. There's just like tons of evidence. Well, what is the evidence? Well, they've written books and things and all that. Okay, what books? Well, there's tons of books out there. Okay, which books? Well, there's one that was called Evolution Something. It's like, well, do you know the author? No, but he's just really smart. It's like, wow, you have a lot of faith in someone you've never met, in a book that maybe you haven't even read yet and you don't remember the name of. So there's a lot of faith being exercised and trusting that someone else has proven things, rather than I know what I believe and let me tell you, I can go all day long as to why, and let me give you all the evidences. I can go on for months and months as to why I believe what I believe. So all I'm here tonight to do is challenge you. Ask yourself, what is it that you really believe and why? And do you really know, or you just kind of think that, and do you maybe just kind of want that to be true? A lot of people don't want the Bible to be true, and I understand that. They don't want to live by God's rules. They want to do their own thing. Many people live their lives that way. But it's not because they've proven that there's no God, it's just that they're uncomfortable with the concept of God, and rather that it not be true, they've heard there are a lot of scientists out there who are proving that God doesn't exist. And it's like, yeah, I'm with them. I don't know the proofs, but I'm with them, and they're smart people, so they feel comfortable with that. They're just exercising faith. That's all they're doing. So with it, that was evolution probable or problematic. One thing I was going to mention on my table, I've got a little handout here. It's just advertised 2 free talks coming up. One you just heard. This was printed yesterday for an event yesterday, so it advertises tonight's event. But also 2 weeks from now, on February 18th, on a Tuesday, I'm giving a talk in New Berlin. They're local talks. Most of the time I'm across the country. I don't speak locally that much anymore, so that's why I wanted to promote that. So if you wanted to take one of those, you can hear further information. I'm giving a talk called Faith is Not a 4-Letter Word. Really interesting talk. It's coming up in a couple weeks.